Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we do a deep dive into being a transaction lawyer in the energy transition and why lawyering in the energy transition is lawyering on hard mode. What are the sources of complexity? What are the pain points about getting a project developed? How has current policy volatility impacted the energy transition, particularly in the US? And what might the future hold? Our guest is Daniel Anziska. Daniel is an infrastructure and regulatory lawyer and partner at Troutman Pepper Lock, a leading US energy transition infrastructure law firm. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
So we've had some trouble sort of thinking about the title of this, but essentially we sort of come up with something like lawyering in the energy transition. And really the story we're about to tell is that side of how to undertake a transaction within the energy transition, obviously particularly in the US, but this is pertinent, I imagine, to most jurisdictions, and essentially how it's transacting on hard mode in some sense, but also to give listeners kind of ideas and pointers about exactly what lawyers do, how they are involved in the process, how to perhaps screen for which ones are more appropriate, and some of the real pain points that come up. Can we just start with a couple of basics? The first one being, what is a transaction lawyer versus, a disputes lawyer and so forth?
A transaction lawyer I would define as a lawyer who helps a person or a company through an acquisition, an investment, a merger, in order to grow their portfolio or grow the entity, the company. A disputes lawyer supports the client, again, could be individual or an entity, to the extent there are disagreements or lack of clarity, let's say, with contracts, and helps navigate that process in order to move forward. And that could take a number of forms, including courtroom litigation, arbitration, or hopefully a negotiated resolution.
It seems like there's quite a range of how engaged and how involved the transaction lawyers can be, up until and including actually negotiating commercials and so forth. What has been the trend over the last 20 years? Has some things that were traditionally sat with the client started to migrate over to lawyers? I mean, can you give us some sense of the full package offering and the trends within that have happened over the last decade or so?
Sure. So I think it does vary by jurisdiction and culture. We have found, in full disclosure, Troutman Pepper Lock, where I'm a partner, is a domestic US focused law firm. So we really operate under US law. But we have found that culturally, the US is more kind of embedded with the attorneys, whereas other jurisdictions like Europe, attorneys are brought in typically at a later time. So part of it, Paul, is cultural. Part of it also is what type of transaction or investment it is and who the client is. So for example, one of our focuses over the past decade have been successful non-US companies entering the US market for purposes of infrastructure, renewables projects, like let's say, Paul, a solar developer or a wind developer. We will typically support them from everything from identifying potential tax benefits, identifying subsidies to the extent there's state or federal subsidies, and helping them navigate a variety of issues and understand issues such as local zoning, for example, Paul, which can vary greatly by jurisdiction in the US. kind of going through the ecosystem of the commercial contracts, the EPC contract, the operation and maintenance contracts, depending on the types of projects. Some of the clients have built out business development teams and contract teams, and they really want our expertise on kind of more bespoke or novel issues. Other clients want to focus on what they do, which is their business, and they tell us to take lead on the investment or transaction. So part of it, I would say, Paul, is cultural.
Mm.
Part of it is client dependent. And yes, the companies that have more built out internal legal teams generally need a little less of the hand holding
Yeah.
than companies that don't.
Are you seeing just? I mean, I just find this a bit fascinating, right? Controlling for companies that have large teams themselves. Why is there that cultural difference? Is that because in the US you've got a lot more complexity? I kind of somewhat doubt that, or is it that actually they're sort of more amenable to just sort of effectively outsourcing a lot of this function compared to in Europe?
It's a good question. I think there is more general built-in sensitivity towards legalities in the US versus most other jurisdictions. That's why I call it a cultural issue. The stereotype is, oh, America is super litigious and everyone sues everyone, so there's always massive risk in the US versus other jurisdictions. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think that there's probably a little more sensitivity towards getting legal involved. Again, this is generally, Paul, at an earlier stage. Now, there's certainly very sophisticated European companies, particularly when they first enter a new jurisdiction like the US, who will get the US counsel involved at the ground stage. So I'm making a general, I would say, cultural observation. And that's really all it is.
Mm.
I do not believe that it is fair to say that US legal issues are more, as you pointed out, are somehow more complex than European
Yeah.
or something, or Asia. I agree with you. I think each jurisdiction has its own bespoke issues, its own regulations, its own personalities. And that's why we do work closely with peer law firms in Europe and in Asia collaboratively because we recognize that.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the pain points in the energy transition itself. But before we do that, just it seems that the energy transition itself is lawyering on hard mode, or is transaction investing on hard mode, because you've got, and well, I'd like to get your take on this, but you've got a lot of regulatory complexity. There's a lot of policy volatility. You're also often stretching across state lines. There's lots of different moving pieces. Can you just give us, and obviously, to your point as well, you mentioned earlier, over the last decade, there has been a lot of European companies, Asian companies coming to the US, a lot of it spurred by the IRA to capture the opportunity over here. Can you give us some sense of what makes the energy transition? Every infrastructure project has sort of EPC challenges, all this kind of stuff. What is it about the energy transition that makes it so difficult and requires, I guess, right from the get-go, sort of legal working in tandem with commercial?
Yeah, I think you did a great job of kind of summarizing
Yeah, sorry.
some of the pain points, and that's a skill, Paul, that you're able to do that because there are a lot of moving pieces. I will echo some of your points in terms of why this is a particularly complex set of issues that are both legal and commercial. I would say the first is what we would call policy, but that really dovetails with US tax and subsidy policy, but that obviously also means practicalities, right? So, for example, the Senate, as we speak, is finalizing language on the one big beautiful bill where wherever it ends up, there are going to be material changes to the IRA tax credits, particularly the Section 48 and 45 credits that the transition renewables industries have really been utilizing over the past several years. Less of a focus right now, Paul, but I would say equally important, has been the Department of Energy, the loan, the grant programs, and other subsidies that have been critical for standing up a domestic energy transition manufacturing capacity, let's call it, which is really the whole solar battery component and product ecosystem, and trying to, if not decouple from China, certainly have much less reliance on China. So you're talking about tax and subsidy policy upfront, which is complex, and it really changes the math on these projects. Now, what we're also seeing is a lot of the time the financing of these projects, whether it's through tax transfers under the IRA and otherwise the ability to harvest some of these tax advantages, the ability to offtake or privately finance both the projects themselves as well as the equipment component companies that were beginning to be funded and springing up, obviously they're inextricably connected. There won't be the same private interest in funding generally when there aren't as positive economic upside, let's call it economic upside, Paul, or benefits to these projects. And then we'll talk about, as you started pointing out, the complexities to building stuff in the US. And that gets into everything from permitting, which we could also refer to as zoning, but that gets into the need to understand from the environmental process locally, nationally, through the EPA, through the NEPA permitting process, as well as the state role, depending on the state you're building in. That is a critical set of issues, and it takes a long time in order to get these approvals. So there really needs to be a strategy up front, because if one waits until they're ready to build to tackle these issues, that will delay the project. The other issues, I would say, are equipment procurement. Beyond kind of the IRA credit issues for domestic manufacturing, or not using China, let's call it, which we still refer to as FIAC, though the one big beautiful bill will have different terms. But even the decoupling from China does not fully appreciate all of the tariffs and duties that are in effect right now in terms of equipment. So a lot of our time is spent on project development, negotiating the EPC contract, negotiating the operation and maintenance contract, and really understanding the supply chain and procurement process, because again, the math can vary significantly. And that can be the difference between being profitable and being unprofitable on a project. And also a lot of the procurement can be delayed if things aren't timed. The other thing to think about are labor, who will construct your project. Is it a union, a non-union state? All of these issues need to be addressed as you go through the issues. And then finally, the ability to use tax equity and other structures, as well as offtake agreements. Those matters are often carefully negotiated and greatly impact the economics on the project. So we're going through 5 or 6, I would say, sets of complicated matters that greatly impact the economics of the project.
Well, and have to go in tandem, right? I mean, that's the...
Of course.
Let's pick through. I mean, we're going to work through 3 of those, right? Because we're going to sort of you've obviously had to deeply understand what your client wants to achieve, and obviously
Yeah.
going through that sort of the EPC bit and who's actually going to build it. I guess I want to first focus on that sort of the maintenance and operation, like basically buying the stuff, the machine tools and all the rest of it. Who's actually going to stand up whatever particular facility it is, right?
Yep.
I mean, that must be so. You've got a complex you've obviously got the commercial piece. You've got the actually do these things, do what does the wind turbine fit our specification kind of thing. But presumably as well, that's quite a shit. Most of this stuff is made in China or Europe. It's quite a shifting landscape out there, and can you give us some sense of timelines? But presumably it's quite a risk before when you start the project and you identify suppliers to when you're actually going to installation, and the shifting policies behind that of course 10 years ago we didn't have to really worry about this, but today we very much do. Can you just how do you manage even that piece?
So you're getting into what I would call brass tacks, which is actually building a sophisticated project. The procurement process needs to be carefully mapped out. There are, in all of these fields, call it solar panels, call it batteries, there are typically a handful of bona fide suppliers who are sophisticated, have history, track record, the ability to stand behind inputs, products, etc. These are carefully negotiated contracts, often multi-site, multi-project procurement deals with all sorts of timing provisions and liquidated damages. Deadlines are missed, Paul, for the reasons you kind of laid out, how important timing is. And there's all sorts of nuances that have had to be negotiated over the past 5 to 10 years as tariffs have really become a significant pain point. And there's all sorts of additional wrinkles we've added into our contracts as a result. But as you've kind of surmised, Paul, these are carefully thought out and negotiated. And it is beyond bad if a client has to sit and wait a year when a project is otherwise ready for construction because they're waiting on inverters or transformers or whatever it is. Or they have to go to a much more expensive alternative.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help navigate this change and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights, a global advisory network dedicated to the sector, providing senior advisors and subject matter experts to investment and infrastructure funds, law firms, and corporates. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections in energy and commodities to give clients the expertise they need when the stakes are high and insight matters. Learn more at encoinsights.com.
Just out of interest, I know this might sound a bit facile, but I agree, Jan 1st contract, I'm going to get my inverters from Spain. I'm making this up. By the time they actually, we get to the point of installing them November 1st of the same year, but during that period tariffs have come down. Are they exempt because the contract was prior to the to tariffs being enacted, or are they suddenly?
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off, Paul. I think that's a great question. That is, how do tariffs actually work? Which is, just taking a step back, it literally is, Paul. Let's say, there's transformers that come from Europe, from Mexico. And let's say this is during a period when all of a sudden there's disagreement on the trade back and forth, and all of a sudden there's a new 25% national security tariff tacked on overnight, which is what in April and May we were seeing, right? If that occurs, the tariff is collected when the transformer is delivered to the US, to the port of entry. So, for example,
you pay a bond at the border, right? Yeah,
and you could have a contract that's been in place for 5 years, a global supply agreement, and these these fact patterns have occurred this year, Paul. And all of a sudden it costs 25% more. And you look at the contract and things people were not focused on 5 years ago, like who's the importer of record? Is there a force majeure or some, I would euphemistically call pain sharing provision if there's a material increase to input costs, equipment cost? How do you deal with that? And all of a sudden, and I won't say all of a sudden, I think we really began as a firm negotiating these provisions a few years ago because there were, if you recall, the national security tariffs under Trump. And the steel and aluminum really did have a major impact at the time. So even the last 6-7 years, I would say that we've more often been including these provisions. But imagine you don't have these provisions and all of a sudden the project owner, because the importer of record, project owner, ultimate party, the way tariffs work, Paul, is you, the US customer, pay the tariff.
Yeah.
And if there is no other negotiated solution with your vendor, you're stuck with the bill. So that's an additional complexity that we've really been dealing with. And the concept of, I would call it trade risk, is something we've been building into our contracts. Now, there's a related issue, Paul, which you may be aware of, which is the UFLPA, which is the Uyghur law.
Yep.
That was enacted during the Biden administration. And that's the law that basically says that there's all sorts of supply chain traceability tests that need to be in effect from the Shenzhen region of China, where a lot of the, at least solar panel inputs like silica, were kind of processed or developed. And that also led to careful negotiations and dealing with Chinese owned companies, solar panels that were held up by customs in the US for these traceability analyses. So these are kind of wrinkles that we all have to think through, Paul, up front, because they can massively impact timing and cost on projects.
You know, and some of those you share, I imagine, with your colleagues in other sectors. But I mean, again, it's kind of somewhat ground zero for tariffs, especially when you start throwing in the critical minerals supply chain. But, you know, do I then send Daniel, can you go and have a wander down to Capitol Hill and do your magic and try and, you know, tell, you know, do lawyers also get involved in governmental relations? Am I using you to go and help plead our case before these bills get enacted?
Yeah, so the answer is I work with certain clients where I coordinate with their lobbyists in order to fully understand the practical impacts of, let's say, proposed changes to the IRA by the tax bill. I generally, as a lawyer, I'm not a lobbyist. I do not generally lobby members of Congress or the administration or something.
You don't lobby, but, you know, obviously it's a key. Engagement is key.
Yeah, engagement is key. And again, it's the key with us is we really understand what the proposed language means, and we can translate that for clients. In the end, you know, their policy shops, their relationships to trade associations are the ones who tend to carry the ball with the administration, members of Congress.
Yeah. You know, you'd be expecting your lawyers to provide you insight on how likely these things might happen, you know, to have that sort of intelligence piece.
Yeah, and we do have good relationships with trade associations in the industry as well as lobbyists. So we actually have a fairly good read of where things are in like the sausage making process. How likely is it that there will be significant amendments to the final tax bill? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Again, information is helpful, but we don't pretend that we as lawyers can materially impact kind of the ultimate resolution.
No.
That really comes on the companies and their shops, their lobbying or government affairs shops, to leverage whatever relationships that they have and influence to make that happen. Because it's hard. It's really, right? Everyone is pulling in different directions.
Yeah.
And there are winners and losers with each of these tweaks. So it's a challenge. There's no doubt.
Well, and it's also such sort of a emotive subject, right?
Yeah.
You know, we just had Joe Bryan on talking about the energy transition in the Department of Defense. And obviously you want to avoid words like climate change in certain circles within the DoD, and you're framing, as energy security, right? As, all the rest of it.
Right.
Okay, so, the next big slug I really want to take on is kind of the offtake agreements, these power purchase agreements, well known to much of our audience.
Yeah.
And then obviously the tax equity piece. How do you actually set up the financing of this to go ahead? Tax equity back in the day, and if you could give us some sense of how this has changed with recent legislation. But essentially, you could have these developers. These projects were far less complex than they are today.
Right.
You could stand up a relatively small developer. You could get big financing from a big bank because they could put 30-40% of the financing into a project, and they could harvest all this tax rebates and that piece, the tax equity piece. It would be advantageous for them. And yeah, for the most part, there weren't tariffs. Stuff would turn up and you could stand up a solar farm, a wind farm, or whatever it might be. And that's how lots of the early stuff in, say, West Texas was done.
Yep.
That obviously landscape has changed. Can you tell us how that has changed and what that has meant for the kind of profile of clients that really have the kind of wherewithal, both financial as well as human capital, to actually deliver on these projects now in such a more complex environment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the concept of tax equity has been around a long time. And prior versions of these credits, they may not have been as turbocharged as the IRA, but prior versions of these credits have existed for, certainly since, let's call it the 2008, 2009, kind of the early Obama era, if not earlier. So there have been banks who really have harvested and helped finance. And we've worked with some of those banks who are really at ground zero in financing these renewable projects. And again, just taking the step back, it's really the ability to, on a tax advantageous basis, provide financing for the project itself. And then the investor gets tax beneficial treatment by virtue of those investments. Those benefits, Paul, were turbocharged with the IRA in terms of solar, wind, but also kind of new cutting edge renewable technologies. And therefore, there was a larger pool of potential investors, including corporates, who would be interested and did indeed participate. That also dovetailed nicely, particularly during the Biden administration, but even before then, with the growth of the ESG movement, as well as corporates that wanted to be responsible from an energy transition standpoint. So all of a sudden,
you could sell your PPAs, right? You could get these long-term deals.
Correct. And there were virtual PPAs that we participated in. And then you have large corporates who are actually receiving, who have massive data centers and warehouses and large sites. And all of a sudden they're users or recipients of the actual renewable energy itself. So it created a really nice ecosystem. And then another advantage was from a grid standpoint, as technologies developed and with AIs and chips and everything else, there's just this ever growing thirst for energy. And it's everywhere, Paul. So the ability to add other sources of generation, on the grid, especially at the local level, has really been essential. And therefore, you've seen, let's say, for example, the growth of, let's say, like the large scale utility batteries, the BESS. And again, having the generous IRA benefits, having the financial players, the banks, the corporates, and all these other investors that have gotten into the game. And then there's this real need for additional sources that don't take 10, 20 years, to build an oil pipeline or to engage in shale to develop a project. It's great, but it takes 10, 20 years, soup to nuts, to develop those new sources. So the fact that you were able to add on much shorter timelines, additional sources has really been helpful.
Yeah.
So it's this whole ecosystem. The last 3-4 years have really, the growth has been exponential.
Hello, I'm David Hunt, founder and managing director at Hyperion Search. Founded over a decade ago, Hyperion Search has helped organizations from major utilities to startups recruit their leadership teams and key individual contributors to accelerate both their growth and the energy transition. Our three main verticals are renewable power, energy storage, and e-mobility. The energy transition and the talent that delivers it has been our passion since day one. To find out more, visit hyperionsearch.com or listen to my Leaders in Cleantech podcast, available on all platforms.
I mean, it really has. You just look at the slated best projects in Texas, right? I mean, it's orders of magnitude more than currently is, storage is today. What sort of, I'm interested to get your take on this, because obviously none of that narrative has changed in terms of the demand picture, right? If anything, we're increasingly seeing AI driving demand. There's population growth again, talking the US here, in areas like the South, which requires a lot more energy. People, the electrification of everything. Yep. Load demand is going up. We've just had the IEA on talking about that, and obviously there is a demand picture that requires quick development of load, and renewables plays a part in that, just simply because of its speed, if anything else. On the flip side, what we have seen compared to that sort of virtuous ecosystem of development, and this is where we're seeing a lot of pain in corporates at the moment, is from an ESG world, right? There's been a walking back of some of these commitments, doesn't seem to have translated into customers willing to pay a premium for green energy. And secondarily, but more importantly perhaps, a lot of what is in the IRA that's driving this is now not in the one big beautiful bill. So that, can you just give us some sense of how sort of existential that what's going to happen this year is for that ecosystem, and how and what clients, customers are doing and thinking about?
Sure. So remember, right now, kind of assuming that the Senate version of the tax bill is fairly consistent with what we'll end up with, there is going to be a ramp down period of the benefits, but they are going to remain in the short term, including for solar and wind, and battery, at least by the Senate, will have a much longer shelf life. So it is still going to exist. There are going to be some restrictions, particularly on the Chinese content of equipment and materials. So there's going to be a lot of need to kind of navigate that process. But they are going to exist, Paul, in the current version.
And what's that ramp down? Is it because there's some talk of 60 days, some talk of 2 years? Is there any idea?
No, that's right. It started at 60 days, but now it's moved to a couple of years, even though you won't have the same percentage of the benefit.
Yeah, and that, just to be clear on that one, that is essentially, unless your project breaks ground within 60 days of it being enacted, it's sort of toast from a regulatory or policy support, right? But now that's
right. That was the original House
which
version.
Is pretty, which
yeah.
I guess there's quite a lot of lawyering would go on about what constitutes breaking ground.
Well, and some of that was more clearly defined by the Senate bill, because under construction was really the key metric in the Senate version. And the Senate version extended it out, again, with a ramp down period for a couple of more years for solar and wind, while for certain other technologies that I guess are viewed as kind of politically more palatable, like batteries, letting it go all through 2033, which would obviously far exceed this administration. So that's an important point, which is it does not. The worst case scenario was that all of the IRA benefits would be repealed immediately, and that anything where the shovel wasn't in the ground wouldn't count, and that does not appear on the table, other than from a handful of really hardcore folks in Congress. So, assuming there is going to be this kind of period where benefits will continue, tax transfer, at least on the Senate side, is still permitted, and there will be a ramp down, the expectation will be that folks will, if anything, double down right now the next couple of years and then go all in on battery, on BESS, which you need anyway. I mean, to me, BESS is almost the simplest because it's so flexible. When you talk about load, kind of the load shedding stuff and being more efficient with allocation, there's just a whole host of opportunities with some of these battery solutions.
Well, not least what we saw in Spain, right? I mean, had they actually had more storage, some of that frequency management could have been better, stopping a blackout. And our sister search firm Hyperion, 90% of their projects are in and around BESS, whether that's commercialization, developers, technologists, all the energy management piece. I mean, it really is a growing sector. But just that thesis there, though, that's interesting. So basically, you've got 2 years when you can capture these benefits of the IRA, and your thesis, I assume, would be, we think let's build as much generation as possible, because once these things shut down or ramp down in 2 years, suddenly you could argue that power prices are going to spike in the US, and whoever has BESS then is going to have a lot of opportunity to kind of manage that and trade around it and all the rest of it, right? So there's, as you say, actually, ironically or counterintuitively, the Senate bill would actually spur 2 years of investment.
Right. And a lot of those, there is an ecosystem of timing, and a lot of these projects have been planned out already. And anyway, the plan, again, kind of what we discussed earlier on in our conversation, in light of equipment availability, in light of construction scheduling, grabbing all of the necessary permits and licenses, people really have planned already through 28 or 27 their projects. So I think you will see continued robust development. The question is, if this passes, will folks start planning for 28, 29, the same robust projects, betting on a later extension of these credits, because historically they have continuously been extended and it's been bipartisan historically, or as you could point out, just kind of from a need standpoint, with just the absolute need on all levels to just get more energy generation production online. And I think those are fair conclusions. We're not fully seeing yet, because understandably, a lot of folks are in wait and see mode because they don't yet know what the rules of the road are and what the economics are. But my guess is once this tax bill passes, and as things stabilize on the tariff front, from a policy standpoint, you'll start getting more clarity on the plans. And I do believe that these kind of energy transition sources will continue to be critically important. I do expect, like gas and oil and these other kind of more traditional, the fossils, to also continue to be developed. But understanding folks have to weigh the costs of development and other issues.
Yeah. It's all of the above. I guess is the one exception, this might be unfair to ask, is wind disadvantagedly treated versus solar in any of these bills, given kind of the Trump administration's detestation of it?
Well, offshore wind is definitely disadvantaged. And 100% offshore wind has been adversely affected by this administration. And even before President Trump stepped into office on January 20th, already there were announced cancellations from some of the large developers because their view was, oh, this administration will be very negative to offshore wind. And yeah, it is negative to offshore wind, but again, recognizing that those projects often have a long gestation period. And we also have to be sensitive that the economics of some of those projects have not been as strong as some of the developers initially thought they would be. So there's also some commercialization growing pains.
Yeah.
In terms of, if you ask me, what is the area kind of even before Trump became president where there was the most growth, I would say it has been best the past couple of years for a variety of reasons, including just the flexibility that those batteries provide from a grid support standpoint.
Yeah, in deregulated markets, I mean, you see, it's a confluence of, arguably it's not necessarily adding to the energy transition, right? If you're just adding storage that can manage fossil fuel sources, but there's absolute commercial, I get the intermittency.
It supports intermittent energy.
Yeah. You've got to build the intermittent energy, but
right.
Yeah.
And it defangs some of the argument that wind and solar are not efficient.
Yeah, it takes away the duck curve, right? And actually, it should actually also, in general, mean that we had to build less load.
Right.
Just, I know I found this actually fascinating. There's that whole piece of NEPA and regulatory and permitting. We've just had Pete Staley back on talking about that and where that kind of sits in the one big beautiful bill and the 7-county decision, which was somewhat momentous. And we had my friend Eugene McGran on talking about sort of the real estate challenges around the energy transition from Cushman Wakefield.
Yeah.
One, I don't know, this isn't in our show notes, but what's happening around. Does nuclear sit within your portfolio? And it starts to seem that might be getting unlocked. There's lots of challenges around it. I mean, you talk about mega projects, right? But where does are you getting lots of inquiries around nuclear and its role?
Yeah. So, full disclosure, our firm has worked on large nuclear projects the past 10 years. There also had been, at least last year, some nascent outreach or interest about the kind of smaller scale nuclear potential projects. Right now, I'm not aware that we're kind of working on any active one, but from a policy and political standpoint, nuclear has kind of flipped. And there appears to be a lot more interest now. Yeah.
I mean, I know from Enco Insights, which is our senior advisory network in this space, that that we are getting a lot of inbound, who knows about this piece, right? And so and we've just seen the World Bank starting to allow funding to it. There seems to be an absolute zeitgeist shift. Whether these, hopefully it can be 4th generation nukes with sort of these salt cooling as opposed to water, because as we've seen in France, these things are quite complex and take a long time to stand up.
Absolutely. And the issue with nuclear has always been that it may for a decade or two grow, but then there's an incident, something that occurs, and it could be outside of the US. And that creates this massive fear and massive concern. And it's just kind of making sure the technology and the willingness to stay firm on the investments is there. The will, let's call it the will, is there. Because if it's not, it's really tough to have folks make the investments in development for a decade.
Yeah, we had Michael Schneider on from the World Nuclear Report a couple of times a couple of years ago, who was very much the species is dead unless it's in places like China where the economics don't apply, right? I mean,
Right.
But, and if you look at my news feed, you think fusion's arriving tomorrow, and we've done a couple of episodes on fusion. So anyway, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. When should people call you and Troutman Pepper? And, I'll make sure to put links in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, the good news with us, Paul, is we're soup to nuts in terms of energy transition. We represent everyone from project developers to project owners, all through the ecosystem. If you're a battery company, component company, we're happy to help you navigate. If you're building any sorts of infrastructure transition project, we have a ton of experience. And if you're an investor or potential investor, we can help you navigate the IRA tax and other issues to kind of kick the car a bit and make sure there are no kind of downside risks that you're unaware of. So anywhere kind of in the US energy transition ecosystem, we're always happy to speak with folks, particularly folks who are, I would say, newer to this industry.
Or at least that region.
Yes, that region in the industry. That's
Yeah.
right. So yeah, that's our sweet spot. We do have very mature clients. We also have longstanding relationships with some of the utilities, the large Southeast utilities, for example, in this country. So I think we really understand from everyone's vantage point kind of what the pain points are.
Yeah, well, fabulous. And then, maybe we can have you on for a quick bonus pod when actually this bill, if it ever does get voted on and voted in, about what it ended up looking like. But it's I mean, I feel like every episode we've done the last couple of months has been, all of it's essentially waiting on what's going to happen here, because not only does it have profound impacts in the US, it also those cascade to those supply chains and those, organizations globally that have been either investing in the US or, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat. I think we're getting close. I can't make promises, Paul, but I do think we're getting close.
Well, July 4th was the deadline. Anyway, well, Dan, this episode will go out after that point. So we,
yes, let's see if all our predictions are true.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been great having you on, and look forward to having you on again in the future.
Absolutely. Take care. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.